My name is Diana, 33 years old, and until a few hours ago, my family thought I was nothing more than a glorified paper pusher. I was sitting at a perfectly set table in the most exclusive country club in the city, nursing a glass of sparkling water. We were there to celebrate my younger sister, Rebecca. At 29, she had just graduated at the top of her SWAT sniper course. She was the golden child, the one my parents Richard and Patricia never stopped bragging about. I, on the other hand, was the permanent disappointment. They thought I worked a mundane clerical job for the government. They had no idea about the classified missions, the brutal tactical combat training, or the fact that my actual rank commanded the respect of 4-star generals. When my husband of 5 years, Trevor, walked up to my table, I assumed he was going to ask if I wanted a drink. Instead, he dropped a thick manila envelope right onto my plate. He said he was filing for divorce, and the entire room went silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Trevor's cruel declaration echoed off the crystal chandeliers of the ballroom, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. He had just decimated my marriage in front of dozens of prominent guests, reducing my 5 years of unwavering loyalty to a punchline, while elevating my younger sister to an untouchable pedestal. His betrayal was staggering, but my specialized training taught me exactly how to process sudden shock. In the field, panic gets you killed. I inhaled a slow breath, keeping my expression entirely blank. I shifted my gaze away from Trevor's smug face and looked directly at my parents, Richard and Patricia. A naive part of my heart still expected them to act like protective parents. I expected outrage. I expected my father to throw Trevor out. I expected my mother to rush to my side or express shock that her youngest daughter was destroying a marriage. Instead, Patricia casually picked up her crystal flute of champagne, taking a delicate, unhurried sip. She did not look horrified. She looked thoroughly inconvenienced by the awkwardness of the moment, yet entirely complacent. She gently set her glass down and offered a dismissive sigh, her eyes devoid of maternal warmth. My father, Richard, adjusted his expensive silk tie and cleared his throat, leaning forward with the authoritative posture he usually reserved for hostile corporate board meetings. He did not offer a single word of comfort. Instead, he looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and told me to sit down and stop making a scene, even though I had not spoken a single syllable. Richard stated in a completely matter-of-fact tone that Trevor and Rebecca's relationship made perfect logical sense. He justified the affair right to my face, claiming that a highly ambitious law enforcement officer like Rebecca naturally needed a driven partner like Trevor. According to him, my quiet, unexceptional life as a desk clerk was actively holding a man of Trevor's caliber back. The betrayal burned through my chest, a toxic mix of anger and disbelief, but I maintained my tactical composure. Then Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick legal document. He slid it across the expensive linen tablecloth, tapping his manicured index finger against the signature line at the bottom page. He explained without hesitation that the paper was a property transfer agreement. Since Trevor and Rebecca were officially starting a new life together, they needed a home that matched their elite status. My father demanded that I sign over my legal equity in the house Trevor and I had shared for the past 5 years. He had the gall to call it a necessary wedding gift for my sister. Patricia chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, explaining that it was only practical. She reasoned that a single woman working a mediocre administrative job did not need a spacious suburban house. She insisted that Rebecca and Trevor needed the space to build a powerful family, and as the older sister, it was my absolute duty to sacrifice my assets for the greater good. They wanted me to walk away with nothing, stripped of my marriage, my dignity, and my financial security, all to pave a golden road for the child they had always favored. The absolute lack of empathy was breathtaking. I looked down at the property transfer document, tracing the sharp edges of the paper, with my eyes calculating the exact legal ramifications of their demand. They were trying to corner me, relying on decades of emotional conditioning that dictated I must always yield to Rebecca's desires. They assumed my silence was submission, a confirmation of the weak passive identity they had assigned to me. Before I could formulate my response, a chair scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor, the harsh sound cutting through the suffocating tension. Nia, my brother Kevin's wife, stood up abruptly. Nia is a brilliant, fiercely loyal African-American woman who had never bought into my family's toxic hierarchy. Her dark eyes flashed with an absolute, unadulterated fury that I rarely saw from her. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the banquet table, causing the silverware to rattle. She glared at my parents and Trevor, her voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. She demanded to know if they had completely lost their minds. She pointed a sharp finger directly at Trevor, calling him a cowardly, opportunistic cheat who was not worth the dirt on my shoes. Then she turned her wrath on Richard and Patricia, blasting them for enabling such a repulsive, heartless betrayal against their own flesh and blood. Nia's righteous anger was a beacon of light in a room full of shadows, a sudden disruption to their carefully orchestrated public execution of my character. She fiercely defended my worth, shouting that I deserved respect and that their blatant cruelty was disgusting. But my mother did not hesitate to retaliate. Patricia's polite facade vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, calculating glare. She looked at Nia with absolute venom and delivered a chilling ultimatum. Patricia stated, her voice dangerously low, that if Nia did not immediately learn her place and sit down, she would cut Kevin out of the family trust entirely. The threat was explicit and financially devastating. Kevin, who had been sitting quietly the entire time, visibly paled. He reached up and tugged desperately at his wife's sleeve, too terrified of losing his financial safety net to stand against our parents. Nia looked down at her husband, profound disappointment washing over her features. She looked at me, her eyes shining with furious, unshed tears on my behalf. I met her gaze and gave her a subtle, steady nod. I was silently thanking her for her bravery, while letting her know that she did not need to fall on her sword for me. I had this situation completely under control. The silence that followed Nia sitting back down was thick and suffocating. The air in the ballroom felt heavy with unspoken tension, the kind that precedes a violent storm. Guests at the surrounding tables desperately tried to avert their eyes, pretending they had not just witnessed the brutal public dismantling of my marriage. Trevor leaned back in his plush chair, completely unfazed by Nia's righteous anger. He poured himself a fresh glass of expensive bourbon, swirling the amber liquid with a look of supreme satisfaction. He had successfully delivered his devastating blow, aligning himself with the family's favorite daughter while ensuring my complete financial and emotional ruin. Richard and Patricia exchanged approving glances, their faces masks of cold complacency. They were eager to sweep the ugliness under the rug and resume their celebration of perfection. They truly believed I was thoroughly defeated, crushed into total submission by their coordinated, ruthless attack. Rebecca decided this was her optimal moment to shine. She refused to let a minor disruption steal her thunder. She wanted to reclaim the spotlight and remind everyone in the opulent room why we were truly gathered there. She picked up a heavy silver spoon and tapped it lightly against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the remaining whispers like a knife. Conversations halted instantly, and all eyes turned toward the head table. Rebecca stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of her designer gown with practiced elegance. She moved with an exaggerated swagger, radiating the sheer arrogance of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. She raised her glass high, a victorious, predatory smile stretching across her face. Her toast began with a sickly sweet display of false humility. She thanked our parents for their unwavering financial support and for hosting such a lavish party in her honor. She turned to Trevor, placing a possessive hand on his shoulder, and thanked him for standing by her side and recognizing her true, undeniable value. Then she launched into a highly inflated, boastful monologue about her recent graduation from the local tactical sniper program. She detailed the physical demands of her training, the grueling hours she spent on the firing range, and her supposedly unparalleled precision. She made sure every wealthy guest in attendance knew she had finished at the absolute top of her class. She painted herself as an elite, hardened warrior operating on a plane far above the ordinary civilians in the room. She spoke loudly about the heavy burden of lethal responsibility, claiming a toughness and grit that she entirely lacked in her actual, privileged character. As her speech reached its crescendo, Rebecca's gaze snapped directly to me. A malicious, triumphant gleam lit up her eyes. She wanted to twist the knife one final time to ensure my public humiliation was absolute and irreversible. She looked down at me with profound, unhidden disgust. She told the crowd that it took a rare elite mindset to thrive in high-stakes tactical environments. She sneered directly at my face, her voice dripping with heavy condescension. She said I would not understand this world. She claimed a soft, fragile administrative worker could never possibly comprehend the intense mental fortitude required to hold a high-powered rifle and make rapid life-or-death decisions. Rebecca raised her glass even higher, puffing out her chest to deliver her ultimate arrogant boast. She locked her eyes onto mine and spoke with ringing clarity. You wouldn't understand this world. Even the legendary military sniper Black VIPER never scared me. She laughed a harsh and grating sound that echoed through the quiet, tense ballroom. She bragged openly that she could easily outshoot the famous VIPER any day of the week, basking in the fabricated glory of an imaginary, one-sided rivalry. I remained perfectly silent in my chair. My posture was relaxed, my face a mask of cold, unreadable stone. I did not flinch, I did not cry, and I certainly did not rise to take her pathetic, desperate bait. The sheer irony of her arrogant boast was almost suffocating. She casually threw around a highly classified military call sign to inflate her own fragile ego, completely oblivious to the dangerous reality sitting right across from her. I am Black VIPER. I have operated deep in hostile territories that she could not even locate on a map. I have commanded classified combat directives under extreme conditions that would make her elite municipal SWAT training look like a weekend summer camp for children. I watched her revel in her deep delusion, knowing with absolute certainty that her entire fabricated reality was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I did not have to wait long for the reckoning. Just as Rebecca moved to take a celebratory sip of her champagne, the atmosphere in the room violently and permanently shifted. The massive heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the banquet hall swung open with a resounding, thunderous crash. The noise was so sudden and explosive that several guests gasped aloud, some dropping their expensive crystal glasses onto the marble floor. A four-star general from the United States Department of Defense marched into the ballroom. He was an imposing, terrifying figure, radiating absolute, undeniable authority. He wore his full-dress military uniform, the dark fabric heavy with highly classified commendations and gleaming medals of valor. He moved with a purposeful, predatory stride, his heavy tactical boots echoing sharply against the polished stone floor. He was flanked by two heavily armed, stone-faced military police officers, their sudden presence instantly transforming the lavish country club from a site of petty suburban family drama into a highly secured zone of federal jurisdiction. The entire room was paralyzed with profound shock. Rebecca's eyes widened to the size of saucers as she stared at the approaching military brass. Her arrogance immediately morphed into a desperate, pathetic craving for validation. She assumed in her boundless and blinding narcissism that a four-star federal general had traveled to a suburban country club specifically to personally congratulate her on joining a local municipal police team. She quickly set her champagne glass down and stepped forward, pushing her shoulders back to display her new badge. She pasted on her most winning, confident smile, preparing to accept the ultimate prestigious praise. She opened her mouth eagerly, extending a hand to introduce herself. The general did not even break his stride. He walked right past Rebecca, completely ignoring her outstretched hand and her eager, grinning face. He treated her as if she were completely invisible, brushing past the family's golden child without a single solitary glance in her direction. Rebecca froze, her hand still suspended awkwardly in the empty air, the confident smile sliding right off her face in a wave of utter, humiliating confusion. The general marched straight toward my table. He stopped squarely in front of me, his posture rigid and intensely commanding. He brought his right hand up and snapped a crisp, razor-sharp military salute. His powerful voice boomed across the dead-silent ballroom, carrying a heavy weight of authority that demanded absolute obedience. He looked me dead in the eyes and delivered the words that instantly destroyed my family's entire universe. "Commander Black Viper, we need you immediately." For a full 10 seconds, nobody breathed. The opulent ballroom, previously buzzing with the clinking of crystal and the low hum of wealthy socialites, transformed into a vacuum. The general's booming voice seemed to echo off the vaulted ceilings, hanging in the air like a physical weight. I did not break eye contact with the 4-star officer standing before me. My posture, previously relaxed to maintain my cover, shifted infinitesimally. My spine straightened, my shoulders squared, and the carefully crafted persona of a meek, unremarkable desk clerk dissolved into the ether. I could see the peripheral reactions without turning my head. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were frozen statues of utter bewilderment. Their mouths hung open, their calculating minds completely short-circuiting as they tried to process the impossible reality unfolding in front of their eyes. Rebecca looked as though the floor had just dropped out from underneath her. The arrogant, triumphant smirk that had plastered her face moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a pale, trembling mask of raw panic. Her brain was violently rejecting the scenario. In her narcissistic universe, there was simply no space for her inferior older sister to be acknowledged by federal military brass, let alone addressed with a highly classified legendary call sign. But it was Trevor whose fragile ego shattered the loudest. He had just staked his entire future, his reputation and his pride on discarding a woman he deemed utterly worthless. He had orchestrated this public humiliation to elevate himself, and now a genuine military general was treating me like a high-ranking asset. Trevor's mind could not accept it. He desperately needed to regain control of the narrative he had so carefully constructed. His face flushed with a dark, ugly red, the veins in his neck bulging as indignation overtook his initial shock. He genuinely believed this was an elaborate, spiteful prank. He convinced himself that I had hired an actor to ruin his moment of glory to steal the spotlight from his new elite partner. Trevor took a heavy, aggressive step forward. He scoffed loudly, a harsh, dismissive sound meant to break the tension and assert his dominance. He spat out a mocking comment, loudly declaring that this theatrical stunt was pathetic even for me. He closed the distance between us with alarming speed, his eyes blazing with a toxic mix of humiliation and rage. He reached out his hand, snapping forward like a striking snake, and aggressively grabbed my left arm. His fingers dug painfully into my skin, his grip bruising and possessive. He yanked me backward, attempting to physically drag me away from the general and force me back into the submissive role I had played for 5 long years. I made a fatal miscalculation. He touched an active combat-ready operative who had just been activated for duty. In less than 1/10 of a second, muscle memory and years of brutal tactical combat training took over. I did not think, I simply reacted. I dropped my center of gravity, pivoting sharply on my right heel to use his own aggressive momentum against him. I clamped my free hand over his wrist, securing his grip while my other arm shot upward, striking his elbow joint with calculated, non-lethal precision. Trevor let out a sharp, choked gasp as his joint locked. I twisted his arm sharply behind his back, applying just enough torque to immobilize him without snapping the bone. With a fluid, unbroken motion, I drove him downward. His expensive tailored suit meant nothing against sheer kinetic force. I pinned him face first onto the banquet table. The impact was explosive. His jaw slammed into the heavy linen tablecloth. Crystal champagne flutes shattered into 100 glittering pieces, raining down onto the polished marble floor. Expensive china plates clattered loudly, and a towering centerpiece of white roses toppled over, spilling cold water across the surface. The sound of breaking glass and splintering porcelain rang out like a gunshot in the dead silent room. I held him there, my knee pressed firmly into the small of his back, my grip on his twisted arm, completely unyielding. Trevor let out a pathetic, breathless groan, his face pressed against broken glass and spilled wine. He tried to struggle, his legs thrashing against the heavy wooden legs of the table, but my hold was an iron vice. I applied a fraction more pressure to his locked shoulder, and he immediately froze, crying out in sudden, sharp pain. The entire country club erupted into terrified collective gasps. Several guests screamed, stumbling backward away from our table, knocking over their own chairs in their haste to escape the sudden violence. The two heavily armed military police officers flanking the general instinctively placed their hands on their holstered weapons, assessing the sudden physical altercation. But the general raised a single commanding finger, signaling them to stand down immediately. He recognized the flawless execution of a trained operator, neutralizing a sudden physical threat. He did not look alarmed. He looked thoroughly satisfied. The sheer speed, the lethal precision, and the absolute coldness of my movement shattered any remaining illusions in that opulent room. No mediocre administrative clerk could move like that. No soft, fragile woman could physically dominate a grown man in a fraction of a second with such terrifying clinical efficiency. The silence that followed the crash of breaking crystal was heavy and absolute. Every single person in that ballroom, from my horrified parents to my trembling, wide-eyed sister, finally realized the chilling truth. I was not playing a prank. The general was not mistaken. The lethal, shadowy commander known as Black VIPER was not a myth Rebecca could casually mock to inflate her own ego. She was real. She was standing right in front of them, and she currently had her cheating, arrogant husband pinned to a dining table like a neutralized enemy combatant. The illusion of the weak, compliant daughter was dead, and the predator they had unknowingly mocked had finally been unleashed. I maintained eye contact with the general for a fraction of a second, acknowledging the absolute gravity of his command with a single sharp nod. The sheer magnitude of his presence had effectively paralyzed the room, but my mind was already shifting into operational mode. I released my iron grip on Trevor's twisted arm, shoving him forward slightly as I stepped back. He let out a pathetic, breathless groan, sliding off the edge of the ruined banquet table and crumpling onto the marble floor amidst a pile of shattered crystal and spilled champagne. He clutched his elbow, his face contorted in pain and profound humiliation, but I did not offer him a second glance. My civilian life, along with the pathetic marriage I had endured, was officially terminated. I turned sharply on my heel, my posture rigid and commanding. My father Richard finally managed to unstick his jaw. He stumbled forward, his face flushed with a mixture of outrage and deep confusion, stuttering my name and demanding an immediate explanation. He reached a hand out as if to physically stop me falling back on his usual authoritarian tactics. The two heavily armed military police officers flanking the general simultaneously stepped directly into Richard's path. They did not speak, but the lethal intent in their cold stares forced my father to freeze in his tracks, his hand dropping uselessly to his side. My mother, Patricia, remained glued to her chair, her face completely drained of color, entirely speechless. For the first time in her superficial life, I walked past them without uttering a single word. I did not need to explain myself to people who had just attempted to strip me of my dignity. The wealthy country club guests parted like the Red Sea, pressing themselves against the walls to clear a wide path for the general and my escort. I pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. A massive armored black tactical SUV sat idling at the curb, its heavy engine rumbling with quiet power. The rear door was already open. I climbed inside the fortified vehicle, the heavy armored door slamming shut behind me, plunging me into the secure classified world I actually belonged to. I would later learn from my sister-in-law, Nia, exactly what transpired in that ruined ballroom the second I disappeared from view. The initial shock suffocating the room quickly gave way to absolute chaos, and Rebecca was the epicenter of the storm. Her fragile narcissistic ego simply could not process the reality that her inferior sister outranked her in every conceivable way. Instead of feeling awe or respect, Rebecca went into a state of aggressive, frantic denial. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing her designer gown with shaking hands, and immediately began gaslighting our entire family to salvage her shattered pride. She paced back and forth in front of the head table, her voice shrill and desperate as she addressed the stunned crowd. She loudly insisted that the entire spectacle was a massive, elaborate fraud. She claimed there was absolutely no mathematical possibility that I possessed the physical or mental capacity to hold a legendary tactical call sign. Pushed by pure blinding jealousy, she began hurling vicious accusations. She told our parents and her remaining guests that I must have illegally breached federal databases to steal classified military files to orchestrate this stunt. When that lie failed to gain traction among the silent crowd, she sank even lower. She aggressively shouted that I must have compromised a high-ranking official, sleeping my way into a fake honorary title just to maliciously ruin her special promotion party. She desperately spun a narrative where she remained the elite victim, completely oblivious to how unhinged and pathetic her frantic rationalizations sounded to anyone with basic common sense. While Rebecca threw her hysterical temper tantrum, Trevor slowly pulled himself up from the floor. He brushed the broken glass off his expensive suit, his face a dark, ugly mask of fury and sudden terror. The physical pain in his arm was entirely eclipsed by a profound, calculating panic. He realized instantly that if the general was telling the truth, my resources, power, and federal backing vastly outweighed anything he or my father possessed. The power dynamic had violently inverted, and Trevor was terrified of the impending consequences of his very public infidelity and his attempt to steal my home. Trevor sought out Richard, pulling my father away from Rebecca's ongoing meltdown and steering him into a quiet, secluded alcove near the country club bar. Desperation breeds malicious ingenuity. They realized that my sudden urgent departure on a classified military deployment provided them with a crucial narrow window of opportunity. They assumed I would be completely disconnected from the civilian world, unable to monitor my personal affairs while operating under federal command. Driven by a desperate need to retain control and inflict maximum damage, the two men hatched a ruthless financial plot. Trevor quickly outlined his strategy to Richard. He planned to immediately access every single joint bank account, investment portfolio, and shared financial asset tied to my name. His goal was to digitally drain our entire life savings before the sun came up. He wanted to transfer hundreds of thousands of dollars into hidden offshore holdings that I could not easily trace or recover. Richard, ever the opportunistic corporate shark, eagerly agreed to help expedite the fraudulent transfers through his own banking connections. They firmly believed that by liquidating my assets, they could leave me entirely penniless and legally trapped before I ever had the chance to file official separation papers. They stood in the shadows of the country club scheming to strip away my entire livelihood, blissfully unaware that attempting to steal from an active federal commander would trigger a chain reaction that would completely annihilate their lives. The armored tactical vehicle navigated the winding roads with aggressive efficiency, leaving the country club far behind in the rearview mirror. I sat in the spacious rear cabin, bathed in the dim red glow of the tactical lighting. The heavy silence inside the cabin stood in stark contrast to the chaotic fallout I had just ignited. I mentally shed the meek, submissive persona I had worn like a suffocating second skin for 5 years. The heavy silk evening gown felt entirely absurd now. I reached into the hidden compartment beneath my seat, extracting a specialized secure tablet and my standard-issue tactical communication earpiece. The encrypted interface booted up, immediately syncing my biometric data to the central mainframe. I was no longer a civilian entangled in petty family drama. I was officially on the clock. The transport descended down a steep, unmarked ramp, hidden behind the facade of a decommissioned industrial warehouse on the city outskirts. We plunged deep underground, passing through 3 separate, heavily fortified security checkpoints. Each blast door required retinal scans, voice print verification, and physical identification codes. This was the nerve center of federal covert operations, a highly classified subterranean bunker completely isolated from the civilian world above. The heavy steel doors of the command center slid open, revealing a massive, dimly lit war room. Rows of elite analysts sat hunched over monitors tracking global data streams and satellite feeds. The hum of massive server banks filled the chilled air, a familiar, comforting sound that instantly sharpened my focus. General Croft stood at the center of the room, his hands planted firmly on the edge of a massive interactive holographic tactical table. He had shed his formal dress jacket, his sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms scarred from decades of combat experience. He looked up as I approached, his steely gaze locking onto mine. He did not offer any superficial pleasantries about the scene at the country club. In this room, personal matters were entirely irrelevant. He merely nodded toward the glowing blue schematics hovering above the central table, signaling that a major crisis was actively unfolding. I stepped up to the console, my eyes rapidly scanning the digital terrain maps, shipping manifests, and surveillance photographs scattered across the holographic display. The general began the classified briefing without hesitation. For the past 18 months, federal intelligence had been tracking a sophisticated, highly organized black market syndicate. This syndicate systematically smuggled military-grade weapons, explosive ordnance, and classified tactical gear out of secure federal armories. They were funneling this lethal contraband directly into the hands of international hostile forces and domestic terrorist cells. The operation was ruthless and incredibly difficult to trace because the smugglers were not external enemies. They operated from deep inside the American defense infrastructure, hiding their illegal shipments within legitimate military supply chains. The general swiped a hand across the console, bringing up a complex web of financial transactions, shell companies, and falsified shipping documents. Our analysts had finally cracked the encrypted financial ledger used by the syndicate to launder their massive illicit profits. We had isolated the exact origin point of the stolen weaponry. He tapped a specific coordinate on the digital map, expanding a high-resolution satellite image of a sprawling, heavily fortified corporate logistics compound located just outside the city limits. The compound was massive, surrounded by electrified fencing, and patrolled by private, heavily armed security contractors. He looked at me, his expression deadly serious. He stated that they had a narrow 3-hour window to execute a full-scale zero-dark raid on this primary distribution hub. A massive shipment of stolen assault rifles and tactical explosives was currently being loaded into freight trucks inside that compound. If those trucks left the perimeter, the weapons would vanish into the black market, resulting in catastrophic civilian casualties. I was tasked with leading the primary tactical strike team to breach the facility, secure the stolen armaments, and neutralize the command structure of the smuggling ring. Then the general swiped the screen one final time, bringing up the corporate registration documents for the logistics compound. The brightly colored familiar logo of the defense contracting firm materialized in the center of the holographic display. My blood instantly ran cold. It was Apex Defense Solutions. I stared at the glowing blue text, a profound, chilling realization washing over me. This was the prominent defense contracting firm where my father Richard and my soon-to-be ex-husband, Trevor, served as senior executives. They were the men in charge of regional logistics and financial oversight for this specific facility. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. The sudden, unexplained influx of immense wealth they had been flaunting, the secretive late-night phone calls, their aggressive, desperate attempts to elevate their social status and secure expensive real estate. They were not brilliant corporate businessmen. They were high-level traders. Richard and Trevor were actively utilizing their elite executive clearances to falsify shipping manifests, bypass federal audits, and steal military hardware right under the government's nose. They sold out national security to line their own pockets, arrogant enough to believe their wealthy facades would shield them from federal scrutiny. The sheer magnitude of their greed was almost incomprehensible. They spent years mocking my administrative job, looking down on me from their fabricated pedestals of corporate superiority, completely oblivious that I was the exact federal commander trained to hunt down and eliminate domestic threats like them. A cold, dangerous calm settled deep into my bones. The personal betrayal at the country club paled in comparison to the absolute treason staring me in the face. My family had not just betrayed me, they had betrayed their country. I looked back at General Croft, my jaw set, my tactical focus razor sharp. I confirmed that I understood the objective completely. I turned away from the holographic table and marched directly toward the armory to gear up, ready to burn their entire corrupt empire to the ground. While I strapped on Kevlar and checked my tactical gear, deep underground, my younger sister actively dug her own digital grave across town. The country club disaster had left Rebecca completely unhinged. Her meticulously constructed reality had been publicly obliterated. The sheer humiliation of being ignored by a 4-star general burned through her veins like battery acid. Driven by a frantic, blinding jealousy, she refused to accept defeat. She needed to prove that my military status was a massive, elaborate fraud. She needed tangible evidence to show Trevor and our parents I was merely a manipulative liar who staged the spectacle to ruin her night. Instead of going home to lick her wounds, Rebecca drove straight to the municipal police precinct. She stomped through the double doors, her designer evening gown swapped for civilian clothes, but her arrogant entitlement remained fully intact. As a newly minted SWAT member, she received elevated security clearances within the municipal law enforcement database. In her inflated arrogance, she genuinely believed this local access granted her absolute authority to investigate anyone anywhere. She marched past the night shift desk sergeant without a word and locked herself inside one of the sterile, brightly lit dispatch offices, booting up the secure terminal. Her fingers flew aggressively across the keyboard. She was absolutely determined to rip my entire life apart. She started with standard background checks, pulling my civilian records, financial history, and registered addresses. Everything looked perfectly normal, perfectly boring. This only fueled her irrational rage. She convinced herself I hid supposed criminal activities behind fake administrative documents. She decided to dig deeper, bypassing the standard municipal search parameters and accessing the interconnected federal inquiry portal. Rebecca typed my legal name and social security number into the National Military Database search bar. Hitting enter with a triumphant smirk, she fully expected to find a blank page or a low-level administrative discharge record she could wave in my face. Instead, the screen flickered. A stark, solid black window replaced the standard blue police interface. A single crimson text line materialized in the monitor's center. It stated the requested file was classified under top-tier Department of Defense encryption. A normal, rational law enforcement officer would recognize that warning immediately. A competent professional would understand that municipal police clearance does not override federal military encryption. But Rebecca was entirely blinded by her own narcissism. She viewed the classification warning not as a legal boundary, but as a personal challenge. She assumed it was just a bureaucratic glitch or a flimsy digital wall I had somehow erected to hide my deceit. She arrogantly clicked past the initial warning prompt, utilizing her specific SWAT authorization codes in a desperate attempt to force an override. She typed her badge number and submitted a formal request to bypass the firewall, citing a fabricated municipal investigation. She leaned back in her plastic office chair, crossing her arms, a smug, victorious smile creeping onto her face. Staring at the loading icon spinning on the black screen, she felt convinced she was seconds away from downloading proof of my fabricated military career. She had no idea that she had just initiated a catastrophic digital detonation. The second, her municipal override request, hit the Department of Defense firewall. Silent alarms triggered across multiple federal intelligence agencies. My operational file was actively monitored by the highest echelons of national security. Accessing it required biometric verification and presidential-level clearance. By aggressively attempting to force her way through that encryption using municipal police credentials, Rebecca did not just get a denied access message. She accidentally triggered a Level 1 national security breach deep inside the heavily fortified headquarters of Federal Cyber Command. Automated defense protocols immediately locked onto her digital signature. Within milliseconds, specialized tracking algorithms traced the unauthorized intrusion request directly back to her local police precinct's specific IP address. The system instantly captured her badge number, her login credentials, and her exact physical location. Rebecca thought she was conducting a simple background check. In reality, she illuminated herself on the federal radar as a highly dangerous, unauthorized entity attempting to steal classified military intelligence. Automated federal defense systems do not distinguish between foreign spies and arrogant local cops. They only see a critical threat to national security. Instantly, a digital net slammed down around her. The federal algorithms automatically flagged Rebecca's entire profile. Her new SWAT clearance was immediately logged as compromised. Her name was automatically added to federal watch lists, officially designating her as a potential domestic threat. The system rapidly compiled a comprehensive threat assessment, preparing to dispatch federal agents to neutralize the active breach. Back in the quiet dispatch office, Rebecca remained completely oblivious to the massive federal machinery she just unleashed against herself. She sat staring at the monitor, tapping her foot impatiently as the screen displayed a spinning loading icon. She huffed in pure annoyance, muttering under her breath about the slow, outdated police computers. She even tapped the side of the monitor, assuming the local server was just lagging. She was entirely ignorant of the fact that the screen was not loading my file. The screen was stalled because federal cyber operatives had already seized remote control of her terminal. They were actively downloading her entire digital footprint, locking her out of the municipal network, and preparing the exact legal parameters for her impending arrest. Rebecca smiled at her reflection in the dark monitor, thoroughly convinced she was the smartest, most elite person in the room. She was visualizing the exact look of humiliation on my face when she presented her findings to Trevor and our father. She was practically vibrating with the anticipation of ruining my life. She sat alone in that precinct, basking in her fabricated victory, completely unaware that she had just traded her shiny new sniper badge for a one-way ticket to federal prison. Her desperate, jealous attempt to expose me as a fraud had only succeeded in permanently destroying her own fragile, arrogant existence. While Rebecca sat in that precinct, destroying her own future, Trevor and my father were across town plotting to obliterate mine. They retreated to my father's home office, a dark mahogany fortress designed to project power. The heavy doors were locked tight. Trevor paced the room like a caged animal. The physical pain from my takedown had faded, masked by his surging adrenaline and blinding greed. Operating on pure panic, he needed to strike while he mistakenly believed I was distracted by a sudden military deployment. Richard sat behind his massive desk, fingers flying across his encrypted laptop. As a senior executive at a major defense firm, he possessed high-level banking clearances and intimate knowledge of international financial routing. They spent the last hour compiling every piece of financial data they held on me. They gathered my joint checking accounts and the modest investment portfolio they assumed contained my life's work. Their plan was devastatingly simple. They intended to initiate a massive wire transfer, draining every penny associated with my name and funneling it through untraceable offshore shell corporations. They wanted to leave me destitute. Trevor leaned over the desk, his eyes feverish as he watched the account balances load on the screen. He muttered under his breath, calculating the exact amount of damage they were about to inflict. He scoffed at my pathetic administrative salary, unaware of the actual figures hidden behind layers of digital obfuscation. Richard nodded grimly, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitor. They justified their blatant theft as a necessary defensive maneuver. Richard selected all the available funds typed in the complex routing numbers for a secure bank in the Cayman Islands and confidently hit the execute button. For a brief, agonizing moment, the loading icon spun in the center of the screen. Trevor let out a sharp, triumphant laugh, clapping Richard on the shoulder. He bragged that I would wake up the next morning with absolutely nothing, a broken woman with no money to fight them in court. He visualized my total submission, convinced he had outsmarted a federal commander. They had no idea they were knocking on the heavily fortified door of the United States Treasury. My financial infrastructure was not tied to a standard civilian payroll system. As an undercover special operations commander, my compensation and classified hazard pay were directly linked to federal military black budgets. These were highly restricted phantom accounts, monitored 24 hours a day by advanced financial defense algorithms. Moving $10 required encrypted authorization. Attempting to instantaneously wire hundreds of thousands of dollars to an offshore tax haven without proper biometric clearance was the digital equivalent of kicking a hornet's nest. The screen on Richard's laptop suddenly froze. The spinning loading icon vanished, replaced by a solid, blinding red error message. A harsh mechanical warning tone erupted from the laptop speakers. The text on the screen did not read insufficient funds. It stated in bold, unforgiving letters that an unauthorized foreign transfer of classified federal assets had been detected. Richard blinked, leaning closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He frantically clicked his mouse, attempting to cancel the transaction. Nothing happened. The system was completely unresponsive to his administrative commands. Trevor's triumphant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of rising frantic irritation. He demanded to know what was wrong, assuming Richard had simply inputted the wrong routing number. He urged my father to try it again. Before Richard could even attempt to reboot his terminal, the situation escalated into a full-blown financial catastrophe. The federal defense algorithms did not just block the illegal transfer. They immediately recognized the intrusion as a coordinated cyber attack against government assets. The system traced the unauthorized access request directly back to Richard's specific IP address and his personal executive banking credentials. In a fraction of a second, the automated protocols initiated a comprehensive retaliatory lockdown. Richard watched in absolute horror as a cascade of new notifications flooded his screen. The federal system was not just securing my assets, it was actively hunting the source of the threat. The screen showed his personal checking account being frozen, then his extensive retirement portfolio locked down. His high-limit credit cards were instantly deactivated. Trevor ripped his cell phone from his pocket, his face draining of all color. He pulled up his mobile banking app, his hands trembling violently. His screen displayed the exact same terrifying red error message. His personal fund savings and corporate expense accounts were entirely inaccessible. The federal algorithm had aggressively traced the financial linkages between us, identifying Richard and Trevor as hostile entities attempting to defraud the government. It systematically severed their access to every single dollar they possessed. They were completely severed from the global financial network. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized the room. Richard slammed his fists onto his mahogany desk, shouting at the frozen monitor. He grabbed his desk phone to call his private banker, only to find the line completely dead. The federal freeze had extended to his telecommunications, flagging his devices as compromised instruments of fraud. Trevor paced frantically, running his hands through his hair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He realized the sheer horrifying magnitude of their mistake. They had tried to steal from a ghost, and the ghost had just retaliated by financially erasing them from existence. They stood in that luxurious office, surrounded by the expensive trappings of their supposed superiority, completely and utterly broke. They had no access to cash, no functioning credit, and no way to hire lawyers to defend themselves against the impending fallout. Their arrogant, malicious plan to destroy my life had triggered an automated federal trap that systematically stripped them of their entire wealth in less than 60 seconds. The quiet, complacent world they had ruthlessly ruled was collapsing around them in real time, leaving them gasping for air. Trevor stared blindly at his useless phone, the digital zero burning into his retinas. Richard slumped heavily into his expensive leather chair. The nightmare was only just beginning. The secure tactical communication unit, embedded deep in my ear, chimed with a rapid, high-priority alert. I was standing in the subterranean armory, running a meticulous final diagnostic check on my primary weapon system. The room was alive with the metallic clatter of the elite strike team gearing up for the impending raid. The incoming signal bypassed all standard military channels, routing directly through a highly encrypted emergency protocol I had established solely for my most trusted assets. I tapped the earpiece fully, expecting a critical situational update from General Croft regarding the perimeter defenses of the logistics compound. Instead, a sharp, hurried whisper cut through the digital static. It was Nia. My sister-in-law was breathing heavily, the sound of passing cars and distant sirens echoing faintly in the background. I immediately recognized the genuine, terrifying urgency in her tone. Nia was brilliant, observant, and possessed a fierce, unyielding loyalty that stood in stark contrast to the shallow opportunism of my blood relatives. She was the only person in my orbit who had ever bothered to see past the quiet facade my family forced upon me. She quickly explained that she had slipped out of the family estate under the guise of running a frantic late-night errand. She was risking massive fallout by making this call, using an untraceable burner phone she kept for severe corporate emergencies, because she correctly suspected Richard was already attempting to monitor the family network after his catastrophic financial collapse. Her voice trembled slightly with raw disgust as she relayed the absolute nightmare currently unfolding in a dim, greasy diner on the industrial edge of town. Patricia and Richard were not sitting in their dark mansion mourning the violent disintegration of our family structure. They were actively weaponizing their panic. Desperate to reclaim any semblance of control, after being entirely locked out of their vast illicit wealth, they had resorted to a vicious scorched earth tactic. Nia told me that my parents had arranged an urgent midnight meeting with a notorious sleazy tabloid journalist. This reporter was highly infamous in the city for destroying reputations without a shred of verified evidence, dealing exclusively in sensationalized scandals, manufactured outrage, and ruthless character assassination. Richard had promised the man an exclusive front-page scoop that would guarantee maximum public exposure and explosive internet traffic by sunrise. Nia had managed to eavesdrop on their entire fabricated pitch before she fled the house, and the sheer, calculated malice of their narrative was breathtaking. They were spinning a twisted, pathetic fantasy designed to completely invalidate everything that had happened at the country club. Patricia was putting on the performance of a lifetime, flawlessly playing the role of a devastated, heartbroken mother, coping with a family tragedy. She was telling the journalist that I had suffered a severe, catastrophic psychotic break. They were claiming that my unexceptional, invisible life as an administrative clerk had finally driven me entirely insane. According to their completely fabricated timeline, the overwhelming pressure of my failing marriage and my deep-seated jealousy of Rebecca had caused my fragile mind to snap permanently. They were aggressively insisting to the reporter that my military title, the 4-star general, and the heavily armed escort were all elaborate, deeply disturbed delusions. The depth of their deception was staggering. They painted the precise, calculated tactical takedown of Trevor not as a measured act of self-defense against an aggressive threat, but as a violent, unprovoked, and highly manic assault against a loving, terrified husband. Trevor was apparently feeding into this sick narrative perfectly. Nia heard him promising the journalist exclusive photographs of his bruised arm and ruined designer suit, ready to display his minor injuries to the cameras as undeniable proof of my supposed mental instability. They planned to splash my name across every cheap magazine and morning gossip blog, legally painting me as a highly dangerous, delusional woman, illegally impersonating a high-ranking federal officer. Their ultimate goal was terrifyingly clear and legally manipulative. They wanted to manufacture enough public outrage and concern to force a mandatory psychiatric hold. They intended to have me locked away in a secure civilian medical ward, heavily medicated and completely silenced. They knew that officially branding me as legally insane would instantly discredit any financial or legal moves I might make against them. They wanted to drown the truth of their treason in a sea of sensationalized media garbage before the real federal authorities could act on their monumental financial crimes. A highly publicized media circus is pure poison to an undercover covert operative, and they were attempting to leverage public scrutiny to destroy my operational security. I listened to Nia detail the sheer depravity of my own parents, feeling a cold, dangerous calm settle over my racing thoughts. They would rather paint their oldest daughter as legally insane and destroy her entire public life than admit their own faults or face the consequences of their massive corporate theft. I thanked Nia for her absolute bravery, assuring her in a low, steady voice that her warning had just saved her from the impending catastrophic fallout. I instructed her to stay far away from the family estate and remain totally silent. I terminated the secure connection, my grip tightening on the cold steel of my rifle until my knuckles turned white. The betrayal was absolute, but they fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield they had just stepped onto. They thought they could solve a federal treason investigation with cheap tabloid gossip. They were bringing a pathetic public relations strategy to a highly tactical, heavily armed federal war, and they were about to be completely obliterated. The sterile lighting of the massive underground armory cast long dark shadows across the cold concrete floor as I secured the final magazine into my heavy tactical vest. I absolutely refused to let blinding rage compromise my razor-sharp focus. General Croft's strict mission parameters regarding the illegal weapons ring remained my sole objective, however. Neutralizing the pathetic public relations threat my parents were orchestrating in that greasy diner required only a fraction of my administrative authority. I approached a biometric terminal built into the steel wall of the staging area. I placed my flat palm against the glass scanner. The system verified my identity, granting me unfettered access to the highest levels of the Department of Justice. My parents misunderstood the immense power structure they had provoked. They believed they could manipulate municipal laws to force a psychiatric hold, silencing me before their corporate treason was exposed. They foolishly thought a tabloid journalist possessed the power to dismantle a federal commander. I was about to educate them on the terrifying reality of the Espionage Act. My fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard. I initiated an emergency Level 1 national security injunction. I drafted a comprehensive, highly classified gag order that explicitly categorized any public disclosure regarding my identity, my actions at the country club, or my current operational status as a direct treasonous threat to domestic security. I did not need a local judge to sign off on this document. My command authorization carried the full, unquestionable weight of the federal government. I routed the emergency injunction directly to the Rapid Response Tactical Division of the Department of Justice. I transmitted 2 specific addresses. The first target was the Industrial Park Diner, where Richard and Patricia were currently spinning their desperate web of lies to the local reporter. The second target was the primary printing facility of the tabloid publication itself. I flagged both locations for immediate, overwhelming tactical intervention. I closed the terminal interface with a sharp, decisive keystroke and turned my attention back to the impending raid on the logistics compound. I knew precisely how the secondary operation against my parents would unfold. Within 10 minutes of my authorized transmission, a fleet of unmarked, heavily armored federal utility vehicles materialized out of the darkness, descending upon the rundown diner. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the rain-slicked pavement as highly trained, heavily armed federal agents swarmed the perimeter. They moved with absolute silent precision, establishing a secure cordon around the building before storming through the front entrance. Richard and Patricia were sitting in a sticky vinyl booth, leaning over a scarred formica table, eagerly handing the bewildered journalist a stack of fabricated medical claims. The sudden explosive arrival of tactical federal agents shattered their pathetic conspiracy instantly. The lead agent, clad in full tactical gear, with a federal badge displayed prominently across his chest, approached their booth. He did not ask questions. He did not offer polite explanations. He slapped a thick, sealed legal document directly onto the table right on top of their fabricated evidence. He announced in a voice that brooked absolutely no argument that they were officially being served with a federal gag order under the strict provisions of the Espionage Act. He informed them that any attempt to publish, speak, or disseminate a single word about me would result in immediate arrest and federal prosecution for treason. The sleazy journalist, recognizing the terrifying reality of federal intervention, immediately surrendered his recording devices and notebooks to the agents, terrified of losing his own freedom. He scrambled out of the diner, abandoning my parents without a backward glance. Patricia's carefully constructed facade of the grieving, concerned mother evaporated instantly. She sat frozen in the vinyl booth, staring at the stark federal seal on the legal document. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She realized in that suffocating moment of profound terror that she was entirely powerless. She could not manipulate these heavily armed agents with her usual wealthy suburban tears or threats of social ruin. Richard sat completely paralyzed next to her, his jaw tightly clenched. His arrogant corporate superiority was thoroughly crushed under the undeniable weight of actual lethal authority. The agents stood over them, their presence a silent, terrifying promise of absolute destruction if they dared to disobey the injunction. Simultaneously, a second tactical team violently raided the central offices of the tabloid publication across town. They aggressively seized servers, wiped massive hard drives, and delivered the identical federal gag order to the terrified editor-in-chief. The entire fabricated story was brutally eradicated before a single damaging word could ever reach the printing press or the internet. My parents' completely desperate, highly malicious attempt to destroy my public reputation and force me into a secure psychiatric ward was completely neutralized without me ever having to physically leave the subterranean military bunker. They were left sitting alone in that empty, silent diner, surrounded by the pathetic remnants of their failed conspiracy, finally understanding the true, horrifying scope of the powerful enemy they had foolishly created. I carefully checked the precise digital chronometer securely strapped to my tactical wrist unit. The tactical strike against the weapons smuggling ring was officially greenlit to commence in exactly 4 short minutes. I pulled my specialized tactical mask over my face, securing the encrypted communication array tightly against my lower jaw. My personal civilian cleanup was officially complete. The pathetic psychological warfare they had arrogantly attempted had been utterly dismantled by superior, undeniable federal force. My parents were now securely locked in a state of absolute terrified silence, stripped entirely of their stolen wealth, their voice, and their arrogant illusions. I picked up my customized assault rifle, the cold metal grounding my focus, and marched aggressively out of the heavy steel armory doors to join my waiting strike team, fully prepared to bring the same level of absolute devastation to their massive, highly corrupt corporate empire. The heavy steel doors of the mobile command vehicle slid shut, sealing me inside a state-of-the-art tactical hub. Monitors illuminated the cramped space with a sharp blue glow displaying real-time satellite imagery, thermal drone feeds, and encrypted communication channels. I stood at the central console, my tactical gear fully secured, projecting absolute authority over the impending federal raid. Outside, a torrential downpour battered the reinforced roof of the command truck, turning the sprawling logistics compound into a dark, muddy fortress. General Croft authorized a massive interagency task force for this operation. Our primary objective was to secure the stolen military-grade weaponry and neutralize the smuggling ring operating out of my father and Trevor's corporate facility. The stakes were incredibly high. To ensure operational security and maintain federal jurisdiction, local law enforcement was relegated to the absolute outer perimeter. Municipal SWAT teams were tasked entirely with traffic control and civilian containment, positioning their armored vehicles blocks away from the actual hot zone. It was the safest, most mundane assignment possible, intentionally designed to keep local officers out of the line of fire. I watched the thermal blips on my main monitor as the various teams moved into their assigned positions. Through the encrypted joint frequency, I initiated the final roll call. I utilized my official call sign, my voice cold, steady, and commanding, broadcasting across every single radio earpiece in the operational radius. I confirmed all federal strike teams were in position and ordered the local units to hold the line at all costs. 2 miles away, crouching behind a wet concrete barricade, Rebecca gripped her sniper rifle with white-knuckled fury. The torrential rain soaked her gear, but the cold weather was nothing compared to the blinding, irrational rage boiling inside her chest. Through her earpiece, she heard my voice giving the final authoritative commands. The reality she had desperately tried to deny at the country club was now echoing directly into her ear, confirming my absolute superiority. She was forced to stand in the mud guarding an empty intersection, like a glorified traffic cop, while the sister she had mocked and degraded for years orchestrated a massive federal takedown. Her fragile, inflated ego simply could not process the humiliation of taking direct orders from me. Instead of maintaining discipline, Rebecca allowed her toxic jealousy to completely override her training. She stared through the pouring rain toward the massive dark warehouses of the logistics compound in the distance. In her dangerously narcissistic mind, she convinced herself that I was intentionally humiliating her by placing her on perimeter duty. She believed I was trying to steal all the glory and hide my own supposed incompetence behind federal strike teams. She needed to prove she was the ultimate elite operative. She desperately wanted to capture the smuggling ringleaders herself, drag them out in handcuffs, and publicly expose Black VIPER as a fraud. Rebecca turned to the 3 junior SWAT officers assigned to her barricade. These were young, inexperienced rookies who had always looked up to her arrogant bravado. She fed them a rapid fabricated lie, claiming she had received a covert secondary directive to secure a vulnerable access point on the east side of the primary warehouse. The rookies, intimidated by her confidence and recent graduation status, blindly accepted her authority. They abandoned their critical perimeter post, leaving a massive gap in the containment line. Rebecca slung her sniper rifle over her shoulder and drew her secondary weapon, leading the small, unauthorized squad directly toward the center of the hostile environment. Inside the mobile command vehicle, my eyes tracked the thermal feeds with clinical precision. Federal strike teams flawlessly breached the main loading docks, utilizing flashbangs and synchronized tactical maneuvers to swiftly neutralize the outer guards. The operation was proceeding with mathematical perfection. I monitored the enemy movements, feeding real-time strategic adjustments to the assault leaders on the ground. We were systematically trapping the smugglers inside the central shipping hangar, completely cutting off all their predetermined escape routes. The objective was nearly secured. Suddenly, a sharp warning tone flared on my secondary monitor. The drone operator sitting to my left quickly pulled up a magnified thermal image of the eastern sector. 4 unauthorized heat signatures were rapidly approaching a highly dangerous, uncleared zone of the compound. I instantly recognized the tactical formations of municipal police. A cold wave of dread washed over me as I zoomed in on the lead figure. Despite the rain and darkness, the reckless, aggressive posture was unmistakable. It was Rebecca. She had blatantly disobeyed a federal order, broken the secure perimeter, and actively marched her inexperienced squad straight into the deadliest sector of the active battlefield. She was approaching an old corrugated metal side door of the primary warehouse. Federal intelligence indicated that specific entrance was heavily wired with explosive traps and guarded by the most desperate, heavily armed members of the smuggling syndicate. Rebecca had no access to our classified thermal scans or our real-time enemy movement predictions. She was operating entirely blind, fueled only by a toxic, desperate need for validation. I immediately opened a direct communication channel to her specific local frequency, ordering her to halt her advance and retreat to the perimeter instantly. Rebecca completely ignored my command. She reached up and violently ripped her earpiece out, tossing it into the muddy water below. She signaled her squad to stack up against the rusted metal door. She wanted a glorious, heroic breach to prove her superiority. She raised her heavy tactical boot and aggressively kicked the rusted door open, charging blindly into the dark, echoing expanse of the massive warehouse structure. She absolutely did not find the glorious validation she was desperately seeking, waiting for her in those shadows. Instead, she found a platoon of cornered, heavily armed, and utterly ruthless mercenaries who had been silently waiting in a deadly ambush. The rusted metal door slammed against the interior brick wall with a deafening screech, echoing through the cavernous expanse of the logistics warehouse. Rebecca stepped through the threshold, her weapon raised in what she believed was a textbook tactical entry. The 3 young municipal rookies followed closely behind her, their boots splashing in the shallow puddles of rainwater that had seeped under the loading bays. The interior was pitch black, illuminated only by the erratic flashes of lightning filtering through the high, grimy skylights. The smell of damp concrete, motor oil, and ozone hung thick in the chilled air. She paused for a fraction of a second, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the oppressive darkness, a smug, self-satisfied grin still plastered across her face. She fully expected to find a few panicked smugglers scrambling to hide a pallet of stolen rifles. Easy targets she could quickly subdue and parade in front of the federal agents to prove her ultimate superiority. Instead, the shadows themselves erupted. A blinding flash of muzzle fire illuminated the far end of the warehouse, instantly followed by the deafening rhythmic roar of heavy automatic weapons. The air around Rebecca literally tore apart. High-caliber rounds shredded the concrete walls, sending lethal shards of debris flying in every direction. The deafening sound of incoming fire in an enclosed space was completely paralyzing, a physical force that struck her chest like a sledgehammer. This was not a localized gang operation. These were hardened, cornered mercenaries, equipped with stolen military-grade hardware, and they had established a flawless overlapping field of fire directly aimed at the breached doorway. The first volley of bullets ripped through the air just inches from Rebecca's head. The sheer kinetic shockwave knocked her backward. The three rookies behind her immediately dove for cover, scrambling frantically behind a stack of heavy steel shipping crates positioned near the entrance. Rebecca stumbled, her combat boots slipping on the wet concrete, and fell hard behind a rusted forklift, just as a secondary burst of automatic fire pulverized the doorway where she had stood a second prior. The smug, arrogant fantasy she had constructed in her mind shattered instantaneously, replaced by a cold, absolute terror she had never experienced in her sterile municipal training simulations. She pressed her back against the cold metal of the forklift, her breathing erratic and shallow. The noise was absolutely overwhelming. Bullets pinged and ricocheted off the steel crates shielding her squad, the relentless barrage refusing to offer even a single second of respite. The mercenaries were methodically advancing using suppressive fire to pin the unauthorized municipal team completely down. They were trapped in a fatal kill zone, entirely cut off from the main federal strike force, operating on the opposite side of the sprawling compound. The air grew thick with acrid smoke and pulverized cement dust, choking her lungs and stinging her eyes. One of the rookies, a young officer named Miller, shouted over the deafening gunfire, desperately asking Rebecca for orders. He looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, fully expecting the elite SWAT sniper, who had bragged about her top-tier status, to issue a coordinated counterattack strategy. He waited for her to command the situation, to utilize the tactical superiority she had loudly claimed to possess. He needed covering fire, a flanking maneuver, or simply a decisive command to retreat. Rebecca looked back at him, her face completely drained of color. Her hands gripping her service weapon began to shake violently. The stark, horrifying reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She had no tactical plan. She had no situational awareness. She had blindly led her team into a fatal bottleneck purely out of spite and blinding jealousy, and now they were all going to pay the ultimate price for her reckless narcissism. The pristine targets on a sunny firing range had not shot back. They had not flanked her position with military precision. A heavy-caliber round struck the top of the forklift, showering her helmet with sparking metal fragments. The impact finally broke her. The tough elite persona she had weaponized against me at the country club evaporated completely. The immense pressure of actual lethal combat completely overloaded her fragile psychological defenses. Rebecca dropped her service weapon into the oily puddle at her feet. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her head, and curled into a tight, trembling ball, desperately trying to make herself as small as possible. The rookies watched in sheer horror as their supposed elite leader completely abandoned them. They fired blind shots over the crates, desperately trying to slow the advancing mercenaries, but their municipal weapons were entirely outmatched by the stolen military hardware. The enemy combatants were communicating using tactical hand signals, flanking the pinned-down squad with terrifying efficiency. They were moving in for a brutal, localized execution. Rebecca's trembling escalated into full-blown hysterical sobbing. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the grime and rainwater. The tough, untouchable sniper was reduced to a weeping, paralyzed mess. She scrambled blindly for the radio clipped to her tactical vest. Her fingers fumbled with the activation switch, slipping wildly due to her violent shaking. She pressed the button broadcasting on the open municipal frequency that I was actively monitoring from the federal command vehicle. She did not request tactical support. She did not provide grid coordinates or enemy troop estimates. She simply screamed into the microphone. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of professional discipline, echoing across the radio net, in a pathetic display of absolute cowardice. She sobbed hysterically, begging for someone to save her. She shrieked that she was pinned down, that they had heavy weapons, and that she was going to die in the dirt. Her frantic, weeping pleas broadcasted her utter failure to every single local officer holding the perimeter line. She abandoned all dignity, all pretense of superiority, screaming for a rescue. She absolutely did not deserve. As the shadows of the heavily armed mercenaries closed in around her fragile, crumbling position, the frantic, high-pitched shrieks, tearing through the municipal radio frequency, collided with the icy, disciplined focus, anchoring my mind. I stared at the thermal feed on the command console, watching the bright red enemy heat signatures systematically closing a fatal ring around the 4 isolated blue dots. The tactical situation was mathematically unsalvageable for a ground rescue. The main federal strike force was entirely engaged in securing the massive weapon caches on the western loading docks, fully locked in heavy suppressive fire. Reallocating a breach team to cross the sprawling unsecured compound would take a minimum of 4 minutes. Rebecca and her unauthorized squad of terrified rookies had less than 40 seconds before they were overrun. I ripped the headset from my ear, throwing it onto the black metal console. I did not wait for General Croft to issue a formal directive. I did not waste precious seconds coordinating a doomed ground rescue. I grabbed a highly specialized, custom-modified anti-material rifle secured in the rapid deployment locker by the door. The weapon was heavily calibrated for extreme distance engagements, equipped with an advanced ballistic computing scope. I slammed a heavy magazine of armor-piercing rounds into the receiver, racked the charging handle with a sharp, violent motion, and kicked open the heavy steel door of the command vehicle. The torrential rain instantly assaulted my tactical gear, the freezing water stinging my exposed skin. I sprinted away from the secure federal staging area, my boots churning through the thick mud. My eyes scanned the dark, chaotic industrial skyline, searching for the absolute highest elevation point within a 1-mile radius. I spotted a massive rusted construction crane towering over an adjacent half-finished development site. It was an incredibly dangerous, highly unstable vantage point, completely exposed to the severe storm cells currently battering the city. It was the only viable shooting platform offering a direct line of sight into the localized kill zone where my sister was weeping. I reached the base of the massive steel structure and immediately began to climb. I did not use safety harnesses or standard climbing protocols. I hauled myself up the slick, freezing metal rungs with brutal mechanical efficiency. The wind howled viciously as I ascended past the 100-foot mark, threatening to rip me off the exposed ladder and throw me onto the jagged concrete below. My muscles burned with intense localized lactic acid buildup, but I forced my body upward, driven by pure, adrenaline-fueled operational focus. I reached the narrow graded observation deck of the crane over 200 feet in the air. The physical environment was an absolute nightmare for tactical marksmanship. Gale force crosswinds aggressively shook the entire metal structure, creating a persistent, unpredictable sway. The torrential rain created a dense, moving curtain of water, severely degrading any standard visual capability. I dropped to my stomach on the freezing steel grate, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my joints. I extended the heavy bipod of the rifle, planting it firmly against the rusted metal lip of the platform. I pulled the heavy stock tightly into my shoulder, melding my body with the precision machine. I flipped the protective caps off the advanced optics system, engaging the integrated thermal imaging overlay. The digital crosshairs illuminated the dark, sprawling compound located over 1,500 meters away. Through the chaotic battlefield was reduced to a series of stark, glowing thermal signatures. I located the rusted forklift where Rebecca was cowering. I could see her heat signature curled into a tight, trembling ball. 3 distinct, hostile heat signatures were methodically advancing on her position, their stolen military weapons raised and locked. The lead mercenary, a massive figure moving with aggressive, predatory confidence, stepped out from behind a stack of steel shipping containers. He raised his heavy assault rifle, aiming directly down at the pathetic, weeping figure of my sister. He was preparing to execute her at point-blank range. Without hesitation, I engaged. I had less than 3 seconds to calculate a mathematically impossible trajectory. I factored in the massive distance, calculating the exact parabolic arc the heavy projectile would need to travel to reach the target. I mentally processed the aggressive fluctuating crosswinds, adjusting my point of aim drastically to the left to compensate for the severe aerodynamic drift. I accounted for the heavy rain, the atmospheric pressure, and the unstable sway of the crane beneath me. This was a shot that defied basic physics, a shot that municipal police snipers would consider an absolute myth. I controlled my breathing, slowing my heart rate down to a steady rhythmic crawl. I exhaled slowly, letting the air empty from my lungs, finding the absolute stillness between heartbeats. My finger applied a steady increasing pressure to the trigger. I did not yank it. I let the weapon fire itself. The heavy rifle roared violently, kicking back into my shoulder. The massive armor-piercing round erupted from the barrel, tearing through the torrential rain at supersonic speeds. It crossed the immense 1,500-meter distance in a fraction of a second, slicing through the crosswinds with devastating precision. Through the thermal optic, I watched the immediate catastrophic result of my calculation. The massive projectile struck the lead mercenary's weapon system dead center, obliterating the heavy receiver and transferring massive kinetic shock directly into his upper torso. The sheer force of the impact violently threw him backward, neutralizing the immediate lethal threat just a microsecond before he could pull his own trigger. The remaining two mercenaries froze in absolute unadulterated shock, frantically scanning the dark rain-filled sky, completely unable to comprehend the sheer distance and lethal accuracy of the incoming precision fire. They immediately abandoned their assault and scrambled backward for cover, terrified of the invisible godlike predator hunting them from the storm. Down in the mud, Rebecca kept her eyes tightly squeezed shut, still weeping hysterically, completely oblivious to the impossible miraculous intervention that had just spared her life. The heavy armored transports rumbled back into the brightly lit municipal staging base, their massive tires slick with mud from the sprawling logistics compound. The chaotic aftermath of the federal raid buzzed through the precinct corridors, a chaotic symphony of barking radios, clinking tactical gear, and shouting officers processing the detained mercenaries. I stepped out of the mobile command vehicle, the freezing rain finally giving way to a harsh, biting wind. I kept my tactical helmet secured, my face hidden behind the dark ballistic visor as I observed the unfolding scene from the edge of the secured perimeter. My focus shifted immediately to the medical triage area, established near the primary loading bays. Rebecca sat on the lowered tailgate of a municipal ambulance, a bright orange thermal blanket draped over her trembling shoulders. The hysterical, paralyzing terror that had completely shattered her in the warehouse was rapidly vanishing, replaced by a frantic, calculating energy. She glanced around the bustling staging area, her eyes darting between the exhausted rookie officers and the commanding federal agents. In her deeply fractured narcissistic mind, she deduced that the sheer chaos of the storm and the isolated nature of the warehouse meant there were zero actual witnesses to her pathetic weeping collapse. She convinced herself that the miraculous, impossible sniper shot from the sky was merely anonymous suppressive fire, a lucky break that she could easily manipulate to her own advantage. The local police chief, a stern veteran with decades of hardened street experience, marched across the wet asphalt toward the ambulance. He carried a heavy digital clipboard demanding immediate after-action reports from the unauthorized municipal squad that had inexplicably broken the established federal perimeter. As he approached, Rebecca saw her golden opportunity to completely rewrite history. She threw off the thermal blanket, forcing her trembling legs to steady, and pushed her shoulders back to project an aura of hardened elite superiority. She locked eyes with the chief and delivered a masterful, entirely fabricated performance. She claimed with a straight face and absolute false conviction that she had utilized her elite tactical instincts to identify a critical fatal flaw in the federal containment strategy. She arrogantly stated that she had bravely led her squad into the dark warehouse to plug a massive security gap that my federal strike team had foolishly overlooked. The chief listened with a tight jaw, his pen hovering over his digital notepad, unaware of the sheer magnitude of the lie she was spinning. Rebecca leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a serious, gritty register. She blatantly claimed that when they were ambushed by the heavily armed mercenaries, she did not panic. She lied through her teeth, asserting that she engaged the lead smuggler in brutal close-quarters combat, neutralizing the lethal threat entirely on her own. Rebecca did not stop at simply inflating her own fabricated heroism. She needed to actively destroy my authority to protect her fragile ego. She pointed an aggressive, accusing finger directly at the massive black Federal Command vehicle parked across the lot. She loudly complained to the police chief that the supposed elite federal operatives were utterly incompetent. She claimed my entire command structure was cowardly paralyzed by fear when the heavy resistance started. She stated that Black VIPER and the Federal Strike Force completely abandoned her municipal squad to die in the mud, leaving them trapped without any strategic support or covering fire. She insisted that her own unmatched lethal sniper skills and sheer tactical bravery were the only things that saved the entire operation from becoming a catastrophic, bloody disaster. She painted a picture where she was the ultimate fearless savior, while I was a pathetic, desk-bound fraud who hid safely inside an armored truck while the real warriors fought on the front lines. The sheer audacity of her deception was breathtaking, a toxic manifestation of her deep-seated jealousy, an absolute refusal to accept her own terrifying failure. Before the police chief could even process her outrageous claims, the heavy glass doors of the main precinct swung open with violent force. Richard and Patricia rushed into the bustling staging area, completely bypassing the standard security desk. Richard utilized his high-level corporate defense clearance to muscle his way directly into the restricted tactical zone, his face flushed with frantic energy. They had been notified of the massive raid on their corporate facility and rushed to the scene, desperate to control the narrative and protect their golden child, who they knew was assigned to the perimeter. Patricia let out a dramatic, theatrical gasp the second she spotted Rebecca standing by the ambulance. She sprinted across the wet pavement and threw her arms around her daughter, loudly praising her brave elite warrior. She smoothed Rebecca's damp hair, cooing about how incredibly proud the entire family was of her unmatched tactical superiority. Richard marched up beside them, clapping the police chief firmly on the shoulder. He puffed out his chest, arrogantly boasting to the surrounding officers about his daughter's incredible bravery, treating the active military staging base like a country club cocktail hour. I stepped forward from the deep shadows of the Federal Command vehicle, shedding my heavy, soaking wet tactical vest as I approached the brightly lit triage sector. Patricia and Richard spotted me walking toward them instantly. Instead of showing any parental relief that their oldest daughter survived a massive federal firefight, their faces twisted into ugly masks of absolute unadulterated venom. They fully believed Rebecca's highly malicious fabricated lies without a second thought. Richard sneered openly, loudly commenting to the police chief about how a true elite warrior like his youngest daughter Rebecca had to do all the heavy lifting, while the pathetic, useless administrative clerks just played dress-up in their safe little communication trucks. They glared at me with profound, arrogant disgust, entirely convinced they had won the night, completely unaware of the high-definition digital evidence currently resting securely inside my heavy, dark, secured armored tactical pocket. I did not waste a single breath arguing with Richard. The sheer arrogance radiating from my parents was a toxic cloud I had spent a lifetime learning to ignore. Patricia's triumphant smile and Richard's boastful proclamations echoed through the crowded staging area, pulling the attention of dozens of exhausted municipal officers. They genuinely believed their manufactured reality was impenetrable. I walked straight past them, the heavy tread of my boots silencing their self-righteous chatter. I moved with purposeful, predatory intent toward the primary briefing station located at the center of the precinct's mobile command tent. The local police chief, still holding his digital clipboard and attempting to process Rebecca's fabricated tale of elite heroism, turned to face me. He opened his mouth, likely to question my sudden intrusion. I did not give him the opportunity. I reached into the secured pouch on my tactical belt and extracted a sleek encrypted federal flash drive. I stepped directly in front of the massive high-definition smart monitor mounted to the wall. Without asking for permission, I bypassed the municipal firewall. I plugged the drive into the primary terminal. My clearance protocols immediately overrode the local operating system, blacking out the standard dispatch grid. The sudden shift in lighting drew every eye in the staging area. Dozens of officers, federal agents, and medical personnel turned their attention to the massive screen. Richard and Patricia, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, pushed their way to the front of the crowd, pulling a suddenly pale Rebecca along with them. I stepped back from the console, locking eyes with the police chief. My expression was a mask of absolute, unyielding authority. I informed him in a voice that carried crystal clear across the asphalt that federal operational protocols required immediate, unedited review of all tactical engagements involving unauthorized perimeter breaches. I did not accuse Rebecca of lying. I simply let the undeniable, digital truth execute its own brutal justice. I tapped the key to initiate playback. The massive screen flared to life, projecting the crisp perspective captured directly from the tactical body camera securely mounted to Rebecca's own vest. The timestamp in the corner confirmed the footage was recorded barely 40 minutes ago. The entire municipal precinct watched in absolute heavy, suffocating silence as the digital recording displayed Rebecca arrogantly waving off her perimeter assignment. The audio fed clearly through the heavy speakers, capturing her exact, unauthorized command as she ordered three inexperienced rookie officers to abandon their secure posts. The crowd watched the first-person perspective of her kicking open the rusted warehouse door, a reckless, tactically disastrous maneuver driven by pure vanity. Then the ambush initiated. The heavy overlapping sounds of incoming suppressive fire roared from the monitors. This was the exact moment Rebecca had loudly claimed she engaged the enemy in close-quarters combat. The reality broadcast onto the screen painted a profoundly different, humiliating picture. The entire precinct watched as the camera angle plummeted violently toward the wet concrete floor. The lens captured Rebecca's own service weapon slipping from her trembling fingers, splashing uselessly into an oily puddle. The audio feed did not broadcast the steady commands of a hardened SWAT operative. Instead, the speakers amplified the pathetic, high-pitched and entirely uncontrolled weeping of a terrified fraud. The camera angle remained fixed on her knees, pulled tightly to her chest. She had curled into a tight, trembling ball behind a rusted forklift, abandoning the three young officers she had recklessly marched into a fatal bottleneck. Her hysterical sobbing echoed across the silent staging base. The crowd heard her begging for someone to save her, explicitly confirming she had lost her nerve entirely. The footage continued to roll, cementing her absolute failure. The lens caught the heavy boots of a hostile combatant advancing on her paralyzed position. The shadow of the weapon raised to eliminate her loomed on the concrete. Then the video captured the exact miraculous moment of intervention. The deafening crack of a massive armor-piercing round shattered the audio feed. The hostile combatant was violently thrown backward, his weapon obliterated by the impossible 1,500-meter precision shot I had executed from the swaying construction crane. The footage proved unequivocally that Rebecca did not neutralize a single threat. She simply cowered in the dirt, weeping uncontrollably, until a superior federal commander saved her life. I reached out and paused the video, freezing the image of her discarded weapon lying in the mud. The silence in the staging area was absolute and devastating. Richard's arrogant face drained of all natural color, his jaw hanging slack. The boastful pride he had weaponized against me completely evaporated. Patricia stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth entirely, unable to process the irrefutable visual evidence of her golden child's cowardice. Rebecca herself looked as though she might physically collapse. The smug elite persona she had desperately tried to construct was burned to ash. She stared at the ground, unable to meet the eyes of the dozens of actual disciplined officers who had just witnessed her profound dereliction of duty. The local police chief stepped forward. His initial confusion had morphed into a dark, unforgiving fury. He marched directly up to the trembling Rebecca, ignoring Patricia's desperate protests. He locked eyes with his disgraced officer, stating her reckless actions demonstrated a catastrophic failure of judgment and a profound lack of basic operational integrity. He firmly demanded she surrender her badge immediately. Rebecca trembled violently, tears of genuine humiliation spilling down her cheeks. Her shaking hands fumbled with the Velcro on her tactical vest. She slowly peeled the prestigious SWAT insignia from her chest, holding it out, and handed it to the chief. He snatched it from her trembling fingers with profound disgust. He announced loudly enough for the entire precinct to hear that she was suspended indefinitely for extreme insubordination and lying to a superior. The public execution of her fabricated career was finally complete, leaving her with absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated shame. The heavy silence that followed the police chief stripping Rebecca of her badge was shattered by squealing tires in the precinct parking lot. A luxury sports car slammed to a halt outside the tactical staging area. The glass doors were violently pushed open, and Trevor stumbled into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the command center. He looked absolutely unrecognizable from the arrogant corporate executive who had smugly handed me divorce papers just a few hours prior. His expensive designer suit jacket was missing his silk tie, hung loosely around his collar, and his shirt was drenched in cold sweat. He was breathing heavily, his panicked eyes darting wildly around the crowded room, desperately searching for a lifeline. Trevor had just fled the chaotic scene at his corporate headquarters. He had witnessed firsthand the terrifying reality of a massive federal siege. He saw fleets of armored tactical vehicles surround his polished office building, barricading the exits and trapping his corrupt colleagues inside. He watched heavily armed agents systematically seizing encrypted hard drives, freezing corporate accounts, and carting away boxes of classified financial ledgers linking him to the illegal weapons syndicate. His personal bank accounts were completely zeroed out, his credit cards were rejecting everywhere, and the magnitude of his impending federal prosecution had finally broken his arrogant mind. He stumbled further into the precinct, ignoring the dozens of local officers staring at his pathetic entrance. He spotted Richard and Patricia standing frozen near the triage ambulance and pushed his way toward them. But as he closed the distance, his frantic gaze finally landed on the center of the room. He froze dead in his tracks, his eyes widening in absolute horrifying realization. He saw General Croft, the commanding officer of the federal operation, standing respectfully at my side. He saw the local police chief deferring completely to my tactical assessment. He saw the massive high-definition monitor still displaying the irrefutable, humiliating body camera footage of the ambush. He looked at me, taking in my heavy tactical gear, the encrypted communication array secured to my vest, and the cold, unyielding authority radiating from my posture. The intricate puzzle pieces slammed together in his opportunistic brain. He realized with terrifying clarity that the quiet, submissive woman he had mercilessly discarded was actually the apex predator of the entire federal operation, currently dismantling his life. Trevor possessed no genuine loyalty and no moral compass. He was a parasitic entity who simply attached himself to whoever held the most power in any given room. Just hours ago, he believed Rebecca was his golden ticket to an elite, untouchable lifestyle. Now seeing her stripped of her badge, weeping in disgrace and facing complete professional ruin, his survival instincts aggressively kicked into overdrive. He instantly recognized that his only microscopic chance of avoiding a lengthy federal prison sentence was to appeal to the immense, terrifying power I suddenly wielded. Rebecca, blinded by her own tears and desperate for any shred of comfort, saw Trevor approaching and let out a pathetic, relieved sob. She reached her shaking hands out toward him, fully expecting the man who had promised her the world to wrap her in a protective embrace and defend her against the harsh reality of her failure. She took a step forward, murmuring his name, seeking the validation she so desperately craved. Trevor did not embrace her. He did not offer a single word of comfort. His face twisted into a mask of profound, unfiltered disgust. He raised his hands and shoved Rebecca violently backward, his palms striking her shoulders with aggressive force. Rebecca stumbled, her boots slipping on the wet asphalt, and she crashed hard against the side of the municipal ambulance. She gasped, staring up at him in sheer, unadulterated shock, completely unable to process this brutal, public rejection from the man she had destroyed my marriage to secure. Trevor completely ignored her horrified gasp. He turned his back on the woman he had claimed was his elite, powerful equal and marched directly toward me. His eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate pleading that was truly repulsive to witness. He closed the distance, and right there in the middle of the crowded tactical staging base, his knees buckled. He dropped heavily onto the wet, muddy concrete landing, squarely at the toes of my combat boots. The confident, arrogant corporate shark was reduced to a groveling, sweating mess, publicly submitting to the very woman he had called a mediocre administrative failure. He reached out with trembling hands, attempting to grab the fabric of my tactical pants. I took a single sharp step backward, refusing to let him touch me. He looked up, his face slick with rain and sweat, and began to frantically spin a web of desperate, pathetic lies. He swore that the entire affair was a massive mistake, a horrible lapse in judgment driven entirely by manipulation. He pointed an accusatory finger back at a sobbing Rebecca, loudly claiming that she had aggressively pursued him, that she had poisoned his mind with lies. He begged me to understand that he had been brainwashed by her toxic jealousy, insisting he had always truly loved me. He debased himself, completely offering to be my informant, my servant, anything to avoid the terrifying reality of federal prison. The sheer lack of dignity in his groveling was sickening, a stark contrast to the unyielding discipline of the operatives standing around me. I stared down at him, my expression entirely devoid of sympathy, anger, or even mild amusement. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. His pathetic display did not warrant a conversation, an explanation, or a single drop of emotional energy. I simply raised my right hand and signaled the two heavily armed military police officers standing at the perimeter. They stepped forward instantly, their movements crisp and highly synchronized. I locked my eyes onto Trevor's panicked face and delivered a single cold-blooded operational directive. I ordered the guards to remove the hostile civilian from my tactical staging area and throw him out of the building. The officers grabbed Trevor by his ruined collar, hoisting him forcefully from the mud. They dragged him backward, his expensive shoes scraping uselessly across the wet asphalt as he screamed my name in a final pathetic display of total absolute defeat. The physical removal of Trevor from the municipal staging base was merely the opening move of a much larger eradication. Back in the subterranean command center, my federal intelligence analysts had spent the night tearing through encrypted servers seized during the warehouse raid. The digital forensics team worked with relentless precision to map out the entire black market supply chain. By sunrise, the decryption algorithms finally cracked the heavily guarded financial ledgers belonging to the defense contracting firm. The resulting data dump was a monument to sheer unadulterated corporate greed. The evidence formally and irrefutably linked Richard and Trevor directly to the center of the illegal weapons syndicate. The digital paper trail was absolutely devastating. My father and my soon-to-be ex-husband had utilized their elite executive security clearances to systematically alter highly classified shipping manifests. They had been diverting crates of military-grade hardware to untraceable ghost companies for over 3 years. In exchange for compromising national security, they received millions of dollars in illegal kickbacks, routed through a complex web of offshore tax havens. The analysts uncovered exact timestamps, biometric login records, and recorded communication logs that proved their treason beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. They had sold out their country to fund their lavish country club lifestyle, and the federal government was entirely done playing games. I stood beside General Croft as he reviewed the final intelligence dossier. He did not hesitate. With a single sharp authorization, he forwarded the comprehensive evidence package directly to the Department of Justice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Federal arrest warrants were officially issued for Richard and Trevor. The charges included corporate espionage, grand larceny, conspiracy to distribute military armaments, and high treason. Their passports were flagged, their faces were added to the federal no-fly list, and heavily armed tactical apprehension teams were immediately dispatched to their registered addresses to bring them into federal custody. Across the city, the illusion of my family's untouchable superiority shattered into irreparable pieces. Richard and Patricia had spent the early morning hours frantically trying to leverage their wealthy social connections to bypass the financial freeze. Every single door slammed shut in their faces. Their powerful corporate allies abandoned them. The second rumors of a federal raid began to circulate. Trevor, nursing his bruised ego and facing the reality of decades in a federal penitentiary, had nowhere left to hide. Rebecca, stripped of her badge and her pride, was equally destitute. As news of the federal arrest warrants leaked through their remaining legal contacts, absolute panic consumed them. They realized their impending doom was no longer a hypothetical threat, but an immediate, terrifying reality. In their blinding desperation, they made one final profoundly delusional calculation. They convinced themselves that because we shared the same bloodline, I would ultimately shield them from the consequences of their own actions. They packed themselves into a single vehicle and fled toward the only sanctuary they believed could protect them from the closing federal dragnet. They drove frantically toward my highly secure, gated private compound located deep in the wooded hills just outside the municipal city limits. My residence was not a standard suburban home. It was a fortified tactical safe house designed to withstand aggressive external threats, equipped with reinforced steel, perimeter fencing, motion tracking cameras, and bulletproof glass. I was already safely inside the primary control room, monitoring the exterior surveillance feeds. I was not alone. Hours before the country club disaster unfolded, I had dispatched a trusted, covert security detail to quietly extract my brother Kevin and his wife Nia from their apartment. I knew the collateral damage of my operation would be massive, and I refused to let the only two decent people in my family be caught in the crossfire. Nia and Kevin were safely relocated to my compound, currently standing right beside me as the external proximity alarms began to blare. On the high-definition security monitors, we watched Richard's luxury sedan skid to a halt just inches from the heavy steel security gates. The four of them spilled out of the vehicle completely unhinged by terror. The polished elite facade they had weaponized against me for my entire life was entirely gone. Richard looked disheveled and frantic. Patricia was visibly shaking, clutching her expensive handbag, like a useless shield against the impending federal agents. Trevor paced back and forth, constantly checking his useless cell phone, while Rebecca stared up at the massive security cameras with wide, desperate eyes. They rushed the perimeter gate. Richard grabbed the thick steel bars, shaking them aggressively, completely ignoring the visible security cameras tracking his every movement. He slammed his fist against the intercom call button. His voice crackled through the speakers in my control room, shrill and demanding. He ordered me to open the gates immediately, loudly proclaiming that he was my father and that I had a fundamental obligation to grant them sanctuary. Patricia pushed her way to the speaker, weeping dramatically. She begged me to use my immense federal influence to magically erase the arrest warrants, insisting that a daughter could never send her own family to prison. Trevor shouted into the microphone, offering pathetic, hollow apologies for his infidelity, promising he would do whatever I wanted if I just made the federal agents disappear. They genuinely believed that my authority as Commander Black Viper was a tool they could manipulate for their own survival. They banged their fists against the cold metal, shouting my name into the damp morning air, demanding I sacrifice my sworn duty to protect the very people who had ruthlessly plotted my total destruction just 12 hours prior. Nia crossed her arms, watching their pathetic display on the monitor with profound disgust, while Kevin stared in silent shock at the utter depravity of our parents. I simply watched the screens, my expression cold and unyielding, fully prepared to deliver the final blow to their fabricated reality. The damp, freezing morning air hung heavily over the fortified front courtyard of my compound. I stepped away from the glowing monitors in the secure control room, leaving Nia and Kevin safely inside, and walked deliberately toward the reinforced steel perimeter. The massive bulletproof glass of the pedestrian checkpoint offered a crystal-clear view of the absolute degradation unfolding on the other side of the gate. The polished, elite facade my family had meticulously maintained for decades had entirely melted away, leaving only raw, pathetic desperation. Richard's expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with mud. His face, usually set in lines of arrogant corporate authority, was a mottled canvas of sheer terror. Trevor paced the wet asphalt like a trapped, panicked animal, practically vibrating with the realization that his federal indictment was inescapable. Rebecca leaned heavily against the cold stone pillar, stripped of her stolen sniper bravado, her eyes vacant and terrified as she stared at the impenetrable fortress keeping them out. But it was Patricia who aggressively seized control of their desperate narrative. Seeing my silhouette approach the gate, she threw herself against the cold metal bars. Her manicured hands gripped the steel so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. The composed, ruthless matriarch who had casually sipped vintage champagne while orchestrating my ruin was entirely gone. In her place stood a frantic, unhinged woman, grasping blindly at the last frayed threads of her manipulative power. Patricia's voice echoed through the high-definition exterior microphones, amplified sharply into my private courtyard. She abandoned all pretense of maternal dignity and dove straight into the most toxic, suffocating depths of emotional blackmail. She screamed that I was actively destroying the family bloodline. She shrieked that a federal prison sentence would physically kill my father, that Trevor was absolutely essential for Rebecca's future, and that a loyal, obedient daughter must shield her family from government persecution at all costs. I remained perfectly still on the safe side of the glass, my tactical stance unwavering. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single solitary word of comfort. My utter silence only fueled her psychotic escalation. Realizing that her usual guilt trips were completely bouncing off my operational armor, Patricia resorted to the ultimate desperate theatrical maneuver. She backed away from the heavy gate, stumbling awkwardly on her designer heels. She threw her arms wide, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of manufactured agony. She wailed at the top of her lungs that if I did not immediately pick up my phone call off the federal tactical agents and magically erase the treason warrants, she would end her own life right there on the pavement. She pointed wildly toward the busy, high-speed interstate at the bottom of the wooded hill, aggressively threatening to throw herself directly into oncoming traffic. She swore her blood would permanently stain my hands, insisting that my refusal to save my father and her future son-in-law was a cold-blooded act of premeditated murder against my own mother. It was a masterclass in psychological abuse, a lethal weapon she had wielded against me in smaller, subtler doses for my entire existence. But she fundamentally misunderstood her target. I was no longer the fragile, subservient administrative clerk she remembered. I was a hardened federal operative trained extensively to interrogate hostile combatants and surgically dismantle psychological warfare. I stepped up to the fortified communication panel mounted securely on the stone pillar. I pressed the intercom button, my voice cutting through the damp, freezing air like a serrated blade. I calmly and clinically informed her that municipal emergency services had already been alerted to her exact location due to the triggered proximity alarms. I stated that if she truly intended to inflict physical harm upon herself, a municipal ambulance was currently 3 minutes away, fully prepared to transport her to a secure psychiatric facility for a mandatory involuntary 72-hour evaluation. Patricia froze instantly. Her theatrical, hysterical wailing choked off in her throat. The realization that her ultimate emotional threat had been neutralized with such cold, bureaucratic efficiency left her completely paralyzed. She looked around wildly, suddenly terrified of being involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward, on top of facing her husband's impending federal indictment. The panic in her eyes was profound and absolute. I did not give her a single second to recover her footing. I reached inside the heavy tactical jacket I still wore. I retrieved the thick folded legal document I had confiscated from the ruined banquet table the night before. It was the property transfer agreement. The very same paperwork Richard and Patricia had tried to forcefully coerce me into signing to steal my home and fund Rebecca's fraudulent elite lifestyle. I walked directly up to the heavy steel gate, my boots echoing on the pavement. I located the narrow, reinforced mail slot, designed for secure courier drops. I unlatched the heavy metal flap and slid the crumpled, wine-stained document through the opening. The papers fluttered onto the wet pavement, landing squarely at Richard's expensive, mud-splattered shoes. Trevor and Richard stared down at the document. Instant recognition drained whatever little color remained in their terrified faces. The sheer suffocating irony of the moment settled over them like a physical crushing weight. The weapon they had forged to destroy my life had just been handed back to them as their own execution warrant. I leaned close to the intercom microphone, ensuring my voice broadcasted with absolute chilling clarity across the entire perimeter. I looked directly into Patricia's horrified, tear-streaked face, and then shifted my cold, unforgiving gaze to my trembling, broken father. I repeated the exact manipulative words they had weaponized against me just hours ago, throwing their toxic philosophy right back into their teeth. I told them that a family requires absolute, unwavering loyalty. I reminded them that to build a powerful future, someone must give up their freedom and their comfort for the greater good. I stared them down, my expression entirely devoid of mercy, hesitation, or regret. Family means sacrifice. I stated, my voice echoing like a final verdict across the silent early morning street. It's time to sacrifice. The heavy silence outside the secure perimeter gate was violently shattered by the unmistakable screech of heavy tires tearing across wet asphalt. A massive fleet of armored black sport utility vehicles flooded the narrow tree-lined road leading directly to my compound. Blinding red and blue strobe lights painted the damp morning mist, casting harsh, erratic shadows across the terrified faces of my family. The sheer volume of federal vehicles systematically blocked all possible escape routes, forming an impenetrable steel wall. Heavily armed agents swarmed from the trucks before the tires even came to a complete stop, their tactical boots hitting the pavement in perfect lethal unison. The sudden explosive noise drew the immediate attention of my affluent neighbors. Curtains twitched and heavy oak front doors cracked open as wealthy corporate executives and local socialites stepped out onto their manicured lawns. Their morning coffees were entirely forgotten as they eagerly pulled out their smartphones, eagerly recording the chaotic spectacle unfolding on my driveway. Richard and Trevor did not even have a fraction of a second to attempt an escape. The lead federal agents descended upon them with terrifying, unyielding efficiency. My father, a man who had spent his entire adult life commanding lavish boardrooms and demanding absolute unquestioning submission from everyone around him, was violently spun around by his collar. A massive tactical agent grabbed his expensive suit jacket, slamming him chest first onto the wet, slick hood of a federal cruiser. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists echoed sharply in the freezing air. Trevor suffered a remarkably similar, profoundly humiliating fate. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched yelp as two agents forcefully kicked his legs apart, pinning his face aggressively against the cold metal of another armored vehicle. The arrogant, opportunistic cheat who had publicly humiliated me at a country club was now completely reduced to a sobbing, hyperventilating criminal publicly shackled in front of an audience of highly judgmental onlookers. Patricia stood absolutely paralyzed in the center of the driveway, the property transfer papers blowing uselessly around her expensive designer shoes. Her theatrical threat of throwing herself into oncoming traffic was entirely forgotten, completely erased by the brutal, undeniable reality of federal law enforcement. Her manipulative mind completely short-circuited. She watched in profound, silent horror as the agents read my father and my soon-to-be ex-husband their rights, officially charging them with corporate espionage, grand larceny, and high treason against the United States. She realized in that suffocating moment that her elite social standing was permanently eradicated. She would be blacklisted from every single country club and high society gathering in the state. She was now the wife of a convicted traitor, and the sheer crushing humiliation of her new reality left her utterly breathless and incapable of moving a single muscle. While Patricia froze in silent horror, Rebecca completely lost whatever fragile grip she still held on reality. The family golden child simply could not process the total destruction of her carefully fabricated universe. She saw Trevor, the man she had ruthlessly stolen to secure her elite lifestyle, weeping pathetically in federal handcuffs. She saw her father, the primary source of her unearned wealth and arrogant entitlement, being shoved roughly into the back of an armored transport. Her mind aggressively and violently rejected the scenario. Driven by blinding, irrational panic and a lifetime of unchecked entitlement, she completely abandoned basic common sense. She let out a piercing, unhinged scream, a sound completely devoid of human dignity, and launched herself directly at the federal agents securing Trevor. Rebecca flailed wildly, her manicured nails clawing aggressively at the heavy tactical vest of the arresting officer. She screamed like an absolute maniac, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of fury and profound desperation. She demanded that they release him immediately, aggressively shouting that they had no idea who she was. She aggressively yanked at the agent's shoulder, desperately trying to physically pull him away from Trevor. In her deeply fractured mind, she still believed she possessed the authority of an elite sniper, entirely forgetting that she had been publicly stripped of her badge and indefinitely suspended just hours ago. She shrieked my name toward the secure gate, aggressively blaming me for ruining her perfect, flawless life, insisting to the arresting officers that I was a jealous, vindictive liar who had somehow tricked the entire federal government into punishing her. The federal agent did not hesitate, nor did he care about her local police connections or her wealthy suburban background. He saw an aggressive hostile civilian actively assaulting a federal officer during the execution of high-level treason warrants. With a swift, highly disciplined tactical maneuver, he easily deflected her wildly swinging arms. He grabbed Rebecca by the wrist, twisting her arm sharply behind her back, in a move eerily similar to the one I had used to neutralize Trevor the night before. He forced her face down onto the wet pavement right alongside her disgraced lover. The cold, heavy steel cuffs snapped tightly around her wrists, binding her hands together. The agent loudly informed her that she was officially under federal arrest for assaulting an officer of the law and interfering with an active federal investigation. From the secure safety of my control room, I watched the entire pathetic scene play out on the high-definition exterior monitors. Nia stood right beside me, a look of profound righteous satisfaction shining brightly in her dark eyes. Kevin remained silent, slowly processing the sheer magnitude of the consequences his parents and sister had finally brought upon themselves. The federal agents systematically loaded Richard Trevor and a hysterically sobbing Rebecca into the back of the armored transports. Patricia was left standing entirely alone on the wet driveway, shivering violently in the damp morning air, completely stripped of her husband, her favorite daughter, and her stolen wealth. The heavy tactical vehicles roared to life, their flashing red and blue lights slicing through the morning mist as they pulled away from my perimeter gate. They drove past the massive crowd of whispering, pointing neighbors, carrying the shattered remnants of my highly toxic family, straight toward the unforgiving, inescapable reality of the federal justice system. The blinding studio lights of the national daytime television broadcast reflected off Patricia and Rebecca as they sat on plush beige sofas. They had posted exorbitant bail, draining the very last of their hidden emergency funds, entirely to fund this desperate, highly calculated public relations maneuver. They were attempting a strategy of pure psychological manipulation, utilizing a sympathetic media platform to poison the federal jury pool. They had meticulously curated their appearances for the cameras. Patricia wore a modest conservative cardigan, her hair styled to look appropriately frazzled, while Rebecca opted for a simple, unadorned blouse, shedding her usual flashy designer labels to perfectly embody the role of a persecuted innocent victim. The talk show host leaned forward, her voice dripping with manufactured empathy as she guided them through their fabricated narrative. Patricia dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, staring directly into the main camera. She spun a wildly fictitious tale of unimaginable government overreach, aggressively claiming that her family was being ruthlessly targeted by a jealous, estranged daughter who had somehow manipulated the entire federal justice system. She painted Richard and Trevor as honest, hard-working corporate executives who were entirely innocent of the massive treason charges, insisting they were mere scapegoats in a malicious political witch hunt. Rebecca eagerly seized the spotlight, weaponizing her former municipal law enforcement status to validate their lies. She forcefully claimed that she was a highly decorated tactical officer whose promising career had been violently stolen by a rogue federal agent, abusing her classified power. She insisted that my entire military record was a complete fabrication, and that the raid on the corporate facility was an illegal localized vendetta masquerading as a national security operation. They were aggressively attempting to rewrite reality on live television, hoping to ignite a massive wave of public outrage that would force the Department of Justice to drop the impending federal indictments. Miles away from the sterile television studio, inside the heavily fortified server room of my newly established private sector cybersecurity firm, Nia sat calmly at the primary command console. She was no longer a silent bystander forced to endure my parents' toxic threats. She was now the official director of cybersecurity, commanding a state-of-the-art digital infrastructure. Her dark eyes remained perfectly focused as she monitored the live, high-definition broadcast of their pathetic television performance. She had anticipated this exact public relations maneuver and had prepared a flawless, legally devastating countermeasure. Nia tapped a complex sequence of commands into her encrypted terminal. She was not executing an illegal hack. She was utilizing an official, legally declassified channel. During the federal evidence processing of the seized corporate servers, massive amounts of digital communication logs had been formally entered into the unsealed public court record. Nia had methodically combed through hundreds of hours of decrypted audio files until she located the absolute perfect indisputable weapon. It was a pristine, high-quality ambient recording captured by a security microphone located inside Richard's private executive office at the logistics compound. Operating with absolute clinical efficiency, Nia established a verified secure digital conduit directly to the television network's primary control room. Utilizing a registered federal transparency protocol, she transmitted the declassified audio file directly to the show's executive producers, flagging it with a high-priority, legally verified authentication code. She sat back in her ergonomic chair, a look of profound, righteous satisfaction crossing her features as she watched the live feed waiting for the digital detonation. Back in the television studio, the host was nodding sympathetically as Rebecca continued her aggressive rant about my supposed deceit. Suddenly, the host paused mid-sentence, pressing two fingers against her hidden earpiece as the control room urgently relayed the breaking development. The producers, immediately recognizing the explosive, undeniable journalistic value of the verified audio file they had just received, made a ruthless, instantaneous executive decision. They cut the live studio audio and directly patched the declassified recording straight into the national broadcast feed. The sound of Trevor's arrogant, familiar voice suddenly boomed from the studio, overhead speakers completely overriding Rebecca's pathetic victim narrative. The recording was crystal clear. Millions of viewers listened in absolute shock as Trevor and Richard casually and openly discussed the exact logistical mechanisms of their illegal weapons smuggling syndicate. They laughed uproariously about successfully altering the military shipping manifests, explicitly detailing the millions of dollars in untraceable kickbacks they were funneling into their offshore accounts. Their own voices casually and irrefutably confirmed every single aspect of the massive federal treason indictment they had just spent 10 minutes denying. But the audio file contained a secondary, far more devastating revelation. The recorded conversations shifted from corporate espionage to their personal lives. Trevor's voice echoed through the studio, dripping with profound, unfiltered disgust as he brought up Rebecca. The man she had destroyed my marriage for, the man she believed viewed her as an elite, powerful equal, proceeded to brutally mock her intelligence. Trevor laughed sharply, calling Rebecca a remarkably gullible, useful idiot. I explicitly bragged to Richard about how incredibly easy it had been to manipulate her fragile, massive ego. He admitted that he only tolerated her presence to gain unfettered access to her municipal law enforcement connections and to secure a deeper foothold within the family trust. The studio fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as Richard's voice joined the recording. My father, the man who had elevated Rebecca to the status of a golden child for her entire life, chuckled in agreement. He coldly agreed with Trevor, openly laughing at his own daughter's staggering arrogance and her complete lack of actual tactical skill. He stated that her narcissism made her the perfect blind pawn for their massive corporate operations. The reaction inside the television studio was instantaneous and catastrophic. Patricia's manufactured tears vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror, as the undeniable truth of her husband's treason was broadcast to the entire nation. Rebecca remained frozen in her plush chair, the color rapidly draining from her face, until she looked entirely lifeless. Her jaw hung slack, her eyes wide with a profound, shattering realization. She was forced to listen, on live national television, as the two men she had fiercely defended and idolized brutally exposed her as nothing more than a pathetic, easily manipulated joke. The live studio audience erupted into loud collective gasps of absolute disgust. The host's manufactured empathy evaporated instantly, her posture hardening as she recognized the sheer magnitude of the lies she had just been fed. The carefully orchestrated public relations campaign detonated in real time, permanently and spectacularly, obliterating any remaining shred of public sympathy. My family had arrogantly walked into the spotlight hoping to secure their salvation, completely unaware that Nia had just utilized their own massive arrogance to permanently seal their legal, social, and emotional doom. 7 months passed, bringing a quiet, unyielding justice that reshaped the entire landscape of my existence. The colossal federal investigation had systematically dismantled the corrupt empire my family had so arrogantly built. The prominent defense contracting firm that Richard and Trevor had used to launder their treasonous profits was completely liquidated. The Department of Justice seized every corporate asset, effectively erasing their legacy from the industry. Trevor was found guilty on multiple federal charges of grand larceny and corporate espionage. He was currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his smug entitlement. My father Richard managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by cooperating with the federal prosecutors, but the catastrophic financial penalties completely bankrupted him. The sprawling suburban mansion they prized above all else was aggressively foreclosed upon by the bank. Patricia and Richard were forcibly evicted, their luxury vehicles repossessed in broad daylight. They were currently renting a cramped apartment on the industrial side of the city, permanently blacklisted by every country club and social elite who had once attended their lavish dinner parties. Their spectacular, highly publicized downfall left them with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own ruined reputations. Meanwhile, my own life had expanded into a brilliantly bright, unburdened reality. The highly publicized federal operation had thoroughly vindicated my actions, allowing me to permanently shed the suffocating persona of a mediocre administrative clerk. My legal team had executed my divorce from Trevor with ruthless clinical precision. I stripped him of every single asset he had attempted to hide, securing a highly lucrative settlement that left him drowning in an ocean of insurmountable legal debt. With the toxic dead weight of my biological family entirely removed, I focused my operational energy on building a legitimate, unassailable future. I established an elite private sector tactical security and cyber defense firm. I elevated my brother Kevin and appointed Nia as my primary executive director. We built a corporate fortress based on actual merit, mutual respect, and undeniable loyalty, completely devoid of the manipulative, narcissistic games my parents had always played. To celebrate my absolute, unconditional freedom, I purchased a sleek, custom-engineered matte black sports car. It was a machine built for pure speed and precision, a physical manifestation of the heavy, suffocating chains I had finally managed to break forever. On a crisp, brilliantly sunny Tuesday afternoon, I took the new sports car for a drive along the coastal highway. The powerful engine purred with a deep, resonant growl, the open road stretching out before me like an endless runway of pure possibility. The heavy burden of seeking my parents' conditional approval had vanished completely, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. I had won the war they started simply by refusing to be their silent victim any longer. Needing a quick caffeine boost before heading back to the command center, I exited the highway and navigated the low-slung vehicle into the narrow, oil-stained lane of a mundane roadside fast food drive-thru. The contrast between my high-performance vehicle and the dreary neon-lit exterior of the cheap restaurant was stark. I rolled down my tinted window, the cool ocean breeze filtering into the plush leather cabin. I placed a simple order for a black iced coffee through the crackling, distorted intercom speaker. The voice that confirmed my order sounded utterly exhausted, monotone, and entirely defeated by the crushing reality of minimum wage labor. I pulled the car forward, the heavy engine rumbling quietly as I approached the secondary pickup window to collect my drink. I coasted to a smooth stop beside the sliding glass window. The cashier turned around from the drink fountain holding a flimsy cardboard tray containing my iced coffee. She stepped up to the open window, her head bowed in the universally recognized posture of utter retail exhaustion. She wore a cheap, heavily grease-stained polyester uniform polo. Her hair, previously maintained with expensive salon treatments, was now shoved carelessly into a mandatory restrictive nylon hairnet. She lifted her head to hand over the order, and the mundane afternoon abruptly froze. It was Rebecca, the former elite tactical operative, the golden child who had arrogantly claimed she could outshoot the legendary Black Viper, was now working the midday shift at a roadside burger joint. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the drive-through booth illuminated the deep dark circles under her eyes, and the sheer unadulterated misery etched into her features. Her heavily burdened life had completely unraveled. She had lost her prestigious badge, her stolen lover, and her endless stream of unearned family wealth. We locked eyes through the open window of my luxury sports car. The profound, horrifying realization struck Rebecca with the physical force of a freight train. She saw the sleek, matte black vehicle, the expensive tactical watch on my wrist, and the absolute unyielding power radiating from my posture. The color instantly drained from her already pale face, leaving her looking entirely ghostly. A violent, uncontrollable tremor seized her entire body. Her hands began to shake so aggressively that she completely lost her grip on the flimsy cardboard tray. The iced coffee plummeted downward, crashing onto the metal windowsill and exploding across her grease-stained uniform shirt. The dark liquid splattered everywhere, completing her portrait of absolute, utter degradation. She gasped, a pathetic, strangled sound of pure humiliation escaping her throat as she stared at the mess she had just created. I did not laugh. I did not sneer. I did not offer a single solitary word of pity or gloating victory. I simply reached up and slowly lowered my dark, polarized sunglasses. I looked directly into her terrified, defeated eyes and gave her a single cold, entirely emotionless nod of finality. I rolled up the tinted window, sealing her away in her miserable, manufactured reality. I shifted the car into gear, hit the gas, and the powerful engine roared to life, propelling me forward into a brilliantly bright, untouchable future. The tale of Black Viper reminds us that true strength does not require loud boasts or seeking constant validation from toxic people. Sometimes the family we are born into builds cages of expectation, demanding sacrifices while offering nothing but pure cruelty in return. Diana taught us all that walking away from familiar abuse is the ultimate act of courage. Real family is forged through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine support, not mere biology. Never let arrogant, manipulative individuals define your worth or dim your brilliant future. Have you ever cut ties with toxic relatives